So like the spiritual quest is sort of something itself that emerges out of the very nature of reality. I think that's an incredible narrative. One of the things I'm really fascinated by is how the notions of God, and we talked about this earlier, God and religion are part of this process, so that religion and theological concepts themselves are part of this emergent unfolding, so that you can say, with some poetic license, I suppose, but not too much, that God evolves.
Welcome to the Nordic Metamodern. My name is Lene Rachel Andersen. Today we're going to talk about metamodern spirituality and emergentism. I don't know how to pronounce it, but I have invited Brendan Graham Dempsey to talk about it because he has this really cool Facebook group called Metamodern Spirituality, and he has been writing about this metamodern way of is it a religion that's not a religion, or what is it? So welcome, Brendan.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to have an opportunity to get into some conversation around these topics dear to my heart. So thanks for the invitation.
It's great to have you here. I was on one of your videos about a year or two ago, and our paths have crossed many times in this metamodern ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And there are other people out there who are exploring what is religion and spirituality in the day and age that we're in. How do we deal with it in the aftermath or during postmodernism, and in the modern world where we take perhaps a scientific worldview, and where does spirituality and religion fit in there? So that's what we're going to talk about. But before we do that, I would like you to introduce yourself so that people know who you are.
My name is Brendan Graham Dempsey. I'm a writer. You've kind of already named some of the landscape of ideas that I kind of peruse. I'm particularly interested in what's kind of come to be called the meaning crisis. I'm sure we'll probably talk a little bit about that. But the framework that I'm working in is the metamodern kind of lens, and I'm particularly keen to see how we can engage in sort of a reconstructive project around religion and spirituality after the various forms of rational and postmodern critique and deconstruction of traditional religion, and what that looks like on the other side. I've written, I forget the number that we're at, but there's a metamodern spirituality series of books that I'm putting out, all sort of penned under various names and personae. But it's sort of a ongoing process of trying to look at these issues from various angles. And as you also noted, I do the Metamodern Spirituality podcast, which you were, I think, the second person on there. So very early on, and that was a really wonderful conversation. And it's interesting to see, kind of meet back up and see where we're at now, what might have changed or what's still the same, what have you. So I think those are sort of the main things. And then there's this Emergentism book that is sort of the newest contribution to the Metamodern Spirituality series. It's volume 6. And that is, I would say, probably the most comprehensive approach so far of mine to try to put all this stuff together and package it up and give it to the world and say, here's kind of the way that I see these things at the moment, and trying to articulate that, again, through kind of a metamodern lens of religion and spirituality. So I think that's
I would like to know a little bit more about you, because you have a background as a theologian, and you're also a farmer. And so you have the spirit, the divinity, and you have the soil. So
yes. Well, my theology is very the transcendent is in the immanent. So all that tracks, I guess, with my biography as well. I attended Yale Divinity School. I got my master's there in a field of religion and the arts, or specifically religion and literature. That was sort of a unexpected path, I suppose, that got me there. I originally, back in the day, back in my salad days was exploring the field of biblical studies, and was kind of bound for a seminary track of some kind to maybe teach Christian history or biblical studies at some kind of seminary or something. That track got derailed through various existential crises, which informed a lot of my own approach to worldviews and the issue and the urgency of the theoretical, rational, mentalistic kind of modernistic approach, and how that's had an impact on religion, both culturally, but also I experienced that very personally as well. And so kind of looking beyond sort of the rational modern critique of religion, and exploring a bunch of different avenues after that, eventually brought me to the stuff that I'm doing now. And somewhere in the interim there, I was very interested in the relationship of religion and art, religion and aesthetics, which I still am, but sort of been reformulated. And so that was how I landed at Yale Divinity School studying that. And then in terms of the farmer bit, I'm a homesteader here in Vermont. I run a holistic retreat center called Sky Meadow Retreat in northeastern Vermont. Host Metamodern spirituality retreats here. Have done a couple of those so far, and that's become a regular thing. So this might come up, it might not, but for me also the working the land is it's a spiritual practice, I would say, for me. So that all comes together in that.
I saw a picture of your carrots at some point. I mean, this is really serious agriculture, and it's regenerative and it's sustainable and it's all kinds of things.
Yes, it's there's a sort of permaculture continuum, right? And you can go really deep into that sort of a thing. We're trying our best here, but it's all organic. We don't use any sprays or pesticides or any of that, but just good old fashioned organic gardening here. And we have a garden lot that's 50 feet by 80 feet or something, and grow a lot of potatoes and carrots and a lot of Sky Meadow garlic. So and the last thing I'll say about that, or we can keep going on about that if you're interested, but that also ties in, I think, very much in terms of the way that I view permaculture, not just as a spiritual activity, as I was talking about, but also within the framework of complexity, of thinking about complex systems, there's a important overlap between the kind of theoretical and the very grounded in the literal sense that complexity plays in the way I think, the way I eat, and the way I worship, I guess you could say. So complexity is key for all that, as it is in emergentism.
So one reason why I asked you to say a little bit about your background as a theologian is because when I read your stuff, I sense, I can tell that you have a deep background in theology. I mean, you obviously know the Christian stuff. Did you also study like the Latin and the Greek? I mean, how far into the Hebrew? I mean,
yep, all the above.
Above. Excellent.
Yeah, I did my undergraduate years. I double majored in religious studies and classical civilizations. So I somewhere in all this got probably, if you were to count them up, probably, there was the 4 years of undergraduate doing Greek, 2 years of Latin. I did about a year of Hebrew, but then I continued all that after I graduated. So I did the whole Greek thing. And my Latin, all my dead languages have sort of fallen off. If you don't, use it, you lose it, unfortunately. And there just aren't enough opportunities to speak ancient Greek these days. But I was very into philology. I think my love of Nietzsche also tracks with a lot of that too. There's something about doing sort of the classical approach to things, and you gain a certain appreciation for thinkers in new ways. And Nietzsche and I have, he was also started out kind of a theological bent, turned to classics, and of course the rest is sort of history. But anyway, so I also dabbled in some Sanskrit at one point, and but my modern languages are pretty atrocious. And as I said, dead languages are fairly dead at this point, but I can rear them when needed. I actually put out a book called Gospel, which relates to all this, because I was the approach there was sort of a metamodern take on our relationship to sacred texts, and what do we lose, or what do we keep, what do we remove in our kind of relationship to things. And so I kind of did a kind of classic Jeffersonian thing of taking out the knife and cutting out, parts of the Bible and stitching them together in different ways, but in a very kind of sincerely ironic or earnest sort of way that tried to salvage and reconstruct something. And so I leaned pretty heavily. I dusted off the old Liddell and Scott Greek dictionary for that enterprise. And anyway, people can check that out if they're interested.
And the other reason why I bring this up is because I also studied theology, and I did not complete my studies. I did not, I think I started Hebrew 3 times and never actually learned it. I passed the Greek exam. I cannot speak a single word. I remember that the verb koine is irregular, but apart from that, I think I forgot everything besides the alphabet. And then I also passed the Latin exam. But I mean, my entry into theology was because I thought I was going to be a pastor in the Danish church, which is Lutheran. And I ended up in a serious existential crisis when I read the New Testament as part of my studies, and actually abandoned Christianity and converted to Judaism. And it's one of my the Jewish part is a religion that I had to acquire as an adult. I was about 30 when I did it. And when I read your text and your approach to religion, it is a very Protestant take on religion, and I see a lot of blind angles with regards to other ways of doing religion, so to speak. So that has been one of my and I bring that up because I know where you're coming from. I see what you're doing. I've been struggling with some of the same things myself, and that's also why I would like to talk to you about these things, because a lot of the discussions out there with the meaning crisis and the talks about creating a religion that is not a religion, and the spirituality, I sense that a lot of people do not come from theology, do not have a deep understanding of the religions that are already there. But I sense that you are one of the people who do. And so when you start to play around with it and see, so where can we take it? And the next kind of cultural phase, you actually have really deep roots down into that fabric, and so that's why I brought it up. So that was the theological part of it. Then there's the metamodern part, and we also differ on that, but we're both in that metamodern ecosystem with a lot of people trying to figure out, so what could be after postmodernism. And we are in a very, I mean, you're in the US, I'm in Denmark. And so we are in a modern society with the modern institutions. We have a lot of postmodern influence, a lot of deconstruction. But I would like to let you define metamodernism or metamodernity the way that you see it, and then I'll give my perspective on it, because we have some overlaps and some differences there as well. And a lot of people who are watching this may not be, or listening to this may not be familiar with metamodernity and metamodernism at all. So it's also an introduction to what are we actually talking about?
Yeah, well, that's a big question, and it can go.
Yeah, you get like 30 seconds. So I'll give you a little.
Okay. Well, I like the way you refer to the metamodern ecosystem, right? I mean, there's people engaging these issues with some shared terminology and a lot of overlap of their ideas, but also points of divergence. And so I like to map those points of divergence. I'm also I think of myself as sort of a synthesis of a lot of those things. I try to bring together and see how it is that in some ways I think that we're more or less saying versions of the same thing. And so it's kind of an issue of, do we want to emphasize the differences or emphasize the continuities? I guess in short, I think maybe I could start by saying that starting with my understanding of how you approach metamodernity, I guess I'd say I completely agree with that framing. But maybe I shouldn't do it that way, because you should just speak for yourself, and then we can kind of compare notes after that. So I guess what I'd say is metamodernism, on the one hand, is a kind of cultural period or a phase that we can refer to chronologically, referring to it's happening at the moment. This is it. And it's one that occurs after postmodernism. And then you can start to say, all right, well, what characterizes this period after postmodernism? And I would say that fundamental to, I think, the key formulations are that it is multi-perspectival, meaning that there's different ways of looking at things that are somehow being incorporated at the same time. And then you can start getting into the theoretical differences. Are these superimposed? Are they oscillating? This and that, right? But the earliest formulations go back to Vermeulen and von Daniker, who talk about an oscillation between typically modern attitudes and typically postmodern attitudes, which in their articulation of it is sort of modernism kind of stands in for utopian aspiration, hopefulness, kind of naive idealism, and then postmodernism sort of typically characterized by kind of cynical, deconstructive, skeptical, unwilling to make grand claims about things, and kind of mercilessly self-aware and hyper self-conscious, etc. Right? So in this one version of that is just seeing that both of those things are happening in some really interesting way, and that you can look at culture and see things that are happening, movies that are being put out, books that are being written that seem to toggle back and forth. One of the things that you did really well, I think a good framing of it, is that you say, yes, that's metamodernism, but it's not just the modern and the postmodern. It's actually more cultural codes than that. So you also you bring in the pre-modern, and you bring in the indigenous, and I think that then you're really dealing with a richer sense of what we're talking about here. And so I, again, totally on board for that. So then what is metamodernism? Well, it's a way of looking at multiple cultural codes, or call them different things, symbol sets, or epistemes, this sort of a thing, but different ways of being that have emerged in history, from indigenous cultures to pre-modern traditional cultures to modern ones to postmodern ones. And that metamodernism looks at sort of all of that. And then it's like, what are we doing? Are we toggling back and forth? Are we somehow synthesizing? Are we this and that? So I would say metamodernism is, generally speaking, a multi-perspectival consideration or approach or sensibility that takes into account all these different ways of being, and I think tries to live a meaningful life in all of that. And then, of course, it's like, then you can really go down the rabbit hole of thinking about these things and trying to understand how do you do that. And so I don't want to preempt some of those discussions, but I think that largely speaking, in this metamodern ecosystem, most people are kind of on board with some version of that. We recognize, what Foucault called different epistemes in culture, and that they're sort of discontinuous. And then metamodernism is in some ways related to kind of integrating those things in various ways. And yeah, I think that's sort of my metamodernism 101 approach to try to answer that.
Because yes, so I mean, so we're pretty much on the same page here. I mean, everything you said, I agree with. That's also how I define metamodernity. I see it as a phase. It's an epoch in time, and it has postmodern elements. It has modern elements. It has pre-modern elements. That's where our theology comes in. And there's these, before modern science and the printing press, how did people make sense of the world, and what were the moral norms and the size of society, the value systems, and so forth. And then before the pre-modern world, which is the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, before that there was the Stone Age. There was hunter-gatherers, and then eventually there was also agriculture or big societies, Stone Age societies, not just tribes, but rather big societies, some of them. But one of the points in metamodernism and metamodernity is that there's no conflict between these cultural zones there or codes. There, because traditionally the pre-modern culture, the modernity that came after it, was sort of distancing itself from the pre-modern and saying, oh, that old religious stuff, we can't use that for anything. That's just superstitions. And why would you believe in revelation? We have science now. And then we get to the postmodern world. It deconstructs both the modern and the pre-modern. It says all this old stuff is just one-dimensional, and it doesn't have the multiple perspectives that we need in order to grasp the complexity of the world. And where from a modern perspective, modernity cannot fully grasp the postmodern world. And so we constantly have these conflicts between people who approach life and culture and civilization from a modern and a postmodern angle. And we see constant clashes between a pre-modern cultural code and a modern cultural code. We see it with theocracies around the globe, like Iran, trying to be a part of the modern world from a pre-modern perspective. And we also see it with people migrating between modern and pre-modern cultures. So there are generally conflicts between them. And one of the qualities or hopes regarding metamodernism, metamodernity, is that we can keep the best from all these, the whole human experience, and a way of dealing with it and seeing some of the sort of big chapters in our collective development is to split it up into these cultural codes and say, okay, so from the pre-modern world, we have religion, we got aesthetics, we got belief, we got poetry, and we got a symbolic world that allows us to deal with existential questions and moral issues in a different way than we could do with modern philosophy. So that's part of it. And
well,
yes,
and can I throw in two things too, which I think also are overlap in our formulations of things. So there's two things. One is complexity, and the other is bildung. So in your book, Metamodernity, these cultural codes not only exist, but they form a kind of series or sequence, one that is sort of defined by their relative complexity. So that, as you say, there's a difference between how a society of 50 hunter-gatherers will organize compared to a, vast urban megacity of, hundreds of thousands. And so this creates differences that have a quantitative wouldn't be the right formulation there, but there's something that they exist on a spectrum of, and that spectrum is relative complexity. And I think that that's important for reasons we'll come back to when we talk about emergentism. Another thing, though, that is, of course, very important in your formulation is bildung, which in the States, in America, we don't really, that word doesn't really, it's not floating in the ether. So something more like education or developmentally appropriate education would be how that might translate. But that's also crucial in the way that I think about metamodernism, and again, a lot of the way that the metamodern ecosystem formulates. Not all, the cultural studies people, not so much, but bildung being really considering that developmental psychology plays a role in individual navigation of the world and the navigation of the relative complexity of these different cultural codes. So I think that once you have all those elements in there, I think that that's a pretty robust kind of framework. And again, I think that that's kind of what a lot of people are swimming in. It then gets into the hairy stuff of like, okay, given all that, as you say, I mean, it's a great point. Like the hope is that how do we navigate these conflicts between these different cultural codes, these different relative levels of complexity or development? That is the hope. And I think people have different models and different ideas for how to do that. And then it's sort of, that's where the rubber meets the road. Yeah.
I would say that the sort of what we're talking about is structures within society. I mean, not quantitative, but there are different societal structures. Exactly, if you have 50 people in a hunter-gatherer tribe, and it's also about political power or relationships. How do you solve conflicts in a society? If you're 50 people, everybody can gather around the campfire or, bowl of soup or something. And you can read body language and you can have eye contact and you can tell if everybody is in on it or if there's still a conflict going on. When you get into a Bronze Age or Iron Age society with, yes, maybe 50,000 or just 10,000 people in a ring-walled city, you cannot solve conflicts like that. And so that's where you have to have a different kind of narrative, power structure, organizing structures. And in the modern world, we developed rule of law and democracy in a different way than the Greek did. They also had rule of law or rule by law and democracy. And that's where we have the nation states with, millions of people. And then we get to the postmodern world where we're connected through digital social media and so forth and mass communication. And we have actually billions of people who are on the same platforms and who do interact. Maybe not everybody at the same time, but we have access to billions of people. And so different power structures. And the question is, how do we bridge those different structures? How do we coexist with all of them? And that's where it does get very complex, because we're not just postmodern with the postmodern approach to things and deconstruction, but we have to make it work with the modern institutions and the human rights and the science and the value hierarchies and the truth hierarchies that come with science, where postmodernism would say, yeah, but that's just your perspective, I got my perspective, and deconstruct everything. And we can't build societies on 8 billion individual perceptions of the world. We do need to come to an agreement on some things. And then there's that deep emotional cultural fabric from the pre-modern. So yes, the hope is that we can figure out how to bring those together and make a meaningful future. And that takes us to the meaning crisis, because not everybody is theologians and have their deep roots down into the pre-modern fabric and think in metamodern terms and try to, or have, I think, for my part, I have found a way of doing this metamodern stuff, and you have found your way. So what is it that you do? We're talking metamodern spirituality. I'm talking about metamodern religion. So I would like to share how I do it, but I would like to hear what you do first.
Yeah, I think that'll be interesting, because I given the framework that we kind of share, right, then you can use that to approach these sorts of issues in different ways. And I would say that they're both still kind of metamodern approaches. They're just kind of doing different things with that framework. So the way that I'm finding, how would I put this? What I'm particularly interested in, I suppose, is trying to articulate spirituality from a distinctly metamodern level angle, right? And I'm sure this will come up when you talk about your approach, because this was something we talked about in the podcast episode. But
we cheated a little bit. We have touched upon this before, so
yeah. But recognizing that there are different cultural codes, and that religion, traditional religion, as we kind of tend to think about it, comes from a particular cultural code, that pre-modern cultural code. What do we do with that? Do we kind of just jump into a pre-modern mindset in order to do religion in that way? Or is there some way that religion looks differently from within a metamodern cultural code, if that makes sense? And so where the angle I take is that latter approach, that I would say that as cultural codes have progressed and complexified, they continually look back and try to kind of reconfigure the past in terms of their own current situation, right? So when you got the advent of modern culture, and you're having all these 18th and 19th century theologians reading the Bible, but doing it in light of historical criticism and archaeology, and then kind of coming face to face with, well, how do we grapple with these stories which don't accord with our rational scientific way of looking at the world? Do we just throw them out? Well, a lot of people took the approach of, well, we can reinterpret these stories through this lens, right? So there was a whole thing of theologians basically looking at things like, say, Moses parting the Dead Sea, and then trying to explain that naturalistically. Say, oh, well, actually, if you look at the way that the tides are and this and that, there's a seasonal thing where it turns red, and that was what this refers to, and this and that, right? So that was one way that the modern cultural code was sort of trying to take up the pre-modern cultural code and reinterpret it. And this happens at kind of all levels, right? So then the postmodern code might be to look at particularly those elements of the Gospels or the prophets that deal with liberation and social injustice, and, you know, tending to the widow and the orphan and the poor and that sort of a thing. And then reading that pre-modern material through a kind of emancipatory postmodern lens, right? So this is just something the cultural codes do. I'm kind of intrigued by looking at religion through a metamodern lens. And for me, though, what is that lens? Well, it's a lens of lenses. It's a lens of considering religion itself as something that evolves, something that moves through cultural codes. And that opens up a really fascinating way to engage religious material. And I think that there's a lot of potential there for then people being able to re-engage with religion, but not necessarily have to cram it into some naturalistic explanation or to some political project or what have you. You actually start to get the whole kind of panorama. And then certain kinds of thinkers, I think, have been exploring this terrain for some time. I mean, Hegel and Desjardins and other people who look at spirit as something that is itself unfolding. And you can kind of create a religion of an evolutionary unfolding of the divine through time. And that becomes very compelling to me. So that's kind of very broad strokes, kind of my approach, primarily, that I'm interested in.
That is what you've done with emergentism. We're not going to get to that yet, because what I have done with, or the way that I live a metamodern religiosity, is through practicing Judaism. And I won't say that I go on a time journey on Shabbat Friday evening, and then because I am in my apartment in Copenhagen, and it is part of the modern world, and I eat modern food, and I enjoy myself, and but it is a way of adding a prehistoric dimension to my modern postmodern week, my life. And the fact that I light candles on Friday evening and say a prayer, lighting those candles, I know that I'm part of a ritual and performing. I'm doing a ritual. I'm doing something that is deeply meaningful and spiritual to me. And it connects me with Jews around the globe. I mean, there's like if you looked at the globe from outer space, you would see all these Jews who at sunset would light the candles, and you would have this whole line of people lighting candles around the globe. But it's also a connection to, I don't know, 3,000 years ago, where people have been celebrating this day of rest and study and pleasure and good food and drinking alcohol, and then you relax for 25 hours, and then you conclude and then you have meals and rituals for that as well, and then you conclude the Shabbos when the sun sets on Saturday. And one of the ways that I describe it is that it's like a meditation that is sort of spread out over 25 hours. So instead of having an intense meditation for, I don't know, 20 minutes, 40 minutes, something like that, I enter a different kind of mode when I light those candles on Friday evening, and it's just different. And it really is sacred in the most secular meaning of the word. I create a feeling through the ritual and through doing this. And there are things that, happen during the rest of the week that simply cannot bother me once I'm in this sacred space and time that is the Sabbath. And one of the things that I mean, this is a way of doing religion that, of course, growing up as a Protestant, I did not have any experience with that, because the Protestant approach to religion is so very much about the faith, and it's about what goes on inside your mind, in your spirit. And there's even a sort of a slight disdain towards ritual, because that's perceived as just outer performance, and it's not the faith is the crucial issue in Protestantism. So it is a different way of doing religion, or being religious. And the metamodern part of it for me is that, so I'm here in my modern, postmodern reality. My thoughts and my way of being in the world, I can deconstruct almost everything that I do. And I enjoy the modern conveniences and my rights, human rights as a woman, which I cannot take for granted. And yet I have these rituals from the Bronze Age and the storytelling, and it's become part of my identity. And so I kind of go back and forth between it. Unfortunately, I do not have a piece of land where I can go back to the Stone Age and grow my own garden, but I do have some pots on my windowsill and grow some herbs. So I do have that slight connection to it on the third floor, but it adds different layers to my reality, my life, and I do not feel a need for creating another religion, another kind of spirituality, because I have the tradition and I integrate it into my life. I also eat kosher. I when there's a buffet, I leave the ham to other people, and I am predominantly a vegetarian. So there is this throughout the rest of the week. There's also this aspect of keeping the ritual. So that's where one of the places where we differ, and therefore I find it extra fascinating that there are other ways of doing it. So I don't see it as a conflict.
Yeah, and I think that's a great model for being able to inhabit those different codes in sort of different intentional ways. The way that I look at it is it's sort of, there are pros and cons to how one approaches it from either of these angles, right? I think that a really important piece that you bring up, repeatedly in the Metamodern spirituality group and in other contexts, is the community part, right? And I think you kind of named it just now, that being part of a community, and you're doing something that many other people are doing, and there's a continuity there, there's a tradition and all that, like that. There's a richness that comes from that, and you don't have that in the same way, let's say, in a context where you're approaching religion from a really novel perspective that doesn't have centuries under its belt, right? You're sort of, in a context where people are trying to figure things out in different ways, and there's not a set way of doing it. And in fact, if anything, there might even be an emphasis on trying to do it your own way. And I think that's what you were getting at when you mentioned if there's a Protestant element to my approach. I would push back a little bit about that, generally speaking, but that's a longer conversation about Protestantism. I mean, because I love the communal and the ritualistic. For me, discovering the difference between Catholic worship and Protestant worship was very eye-opening, right? If I were to attend a church, it would be one full of high ritual and incense and gorgeous works of art and that sort of a thing, rather than the kind of modern Protestant tradition that I was familiar with. So I do get that. And I do think that there's like inherent value to that. I think that I'd like to see something like that emerge in a metamodern context. And some of this we've been experimenting with in these metamodern spirituality retreats in negotiating, discovering the boundaries between autonomy and, kind of group action, and, where does this feel good and where does it feel too much, and that sort of a thing. Anyway, so I think that that's obviously a great pro of the approach that you're taking. And, you could kind of bring in a Vervaekian notion of like religion it operates at the participatory level, the procedural knowing, the propositional knowing. It's all these, you can approach it from these different angles. Protestantism is very propositional. It's what do we believe, it's creedal and that sort of a thing. Whereas what you're naming is very much that participatory, procedural way of being. And so and I would say all of that's really important. I think that the con of it though is, if you're rooted in a tradition that has certain propositional claims that your rational mind can't affirm, right, then what do you do with that? Everything that you said sounds really wonderful, lighting candles, eating food, and that sort of thing, right? But if you're in a particular religious traditional ritual, you're going to hear things said that you're going to be like, whoa, wait a second, I don't know about that. Like, what about the whole God judging the world thing? This doesn't necessarily relate to any particular religion, but when you find yourself in particular ritual contexts, you're invited to sort of buy into things that my rational mind anyway kind of actively opposes. And then there's this sort of conflict between head and heart, if it's like, okay, I can do the ritual, but so then there's the question there, right, of like, well, what if those things could work in concert? What if I could participate in a ritual in a community that the propositional content was stuff that really engendered actual awe, like, and for me, it's like, wow, like the 14 billion year old, evolution of the cosmos and the emergence of consciousness and all this stuff, right? It's like, that's content that excites my religious sensibility. And so I'm in the space of trying to bring those together, right? Because like, how can we do religion in the way you're talking about, but also then update the content of it in a way that all of us, otherwise I feel like ourselves get fractured, we're sort of forced to choose between our procedural and our participatory and our propositional. And then it's sort of like, yeah. So anyway, I think that's basically that's the hang up. And I feel like depending, especially on personality types and different other things, people might find themselves responding to that element of it differently. Yeah.
So I guess now we're kind of approaching your emergentism and what you've been writing there, because that is where you look into the whole universe and how life, well, actually it's matter, life, mind, and culture, and you built that on the American psychologist Greg Henrique's tree of knowledge model, and I actually use that in my book Libertism as well. So can you please describe what it is you're referring to there, because I find it really interesting. I'll elaborate on that also.
So the trying to think of the best way into this. I would say, so essentially what it is it's a big history framework. And by that, I mean, big history is not just human history. It goes all the way back, and it tries to situate sort of the reality in terms of its broadest context, starting with the Big Bang and going all the way up to the present. So historically, people who've engaged in this sort of theories about big history, and they've noted certain moments of really important kind of quantum leaps that occur, and obvious one is life. How do you go from inanimate material to living organisms? That's a huge one, right? So people will say, all right, there's a matter phase to cosmic history, and then life shows up. And then human beings are also on the scene, and we seem to operate in our own very unique way. So people will be like, okay, well, that's very unique too. So a lot of big histories tended to be focused as something like matter, and then life, and then human society. But I think that way of looking at it has become clarified a lot. And Greg Enriquez's work has done a great deal to do that by being more precise in what those kind of points, those sort of that punctuated equilibrium looks like. And the most important thing is that he adds in mind, which in this case means like animals with nervous systems. So and these things are divided according to information processing systems. And I don't mean to get too complex or technical about all this, but basically the tree of life is sort of this that tracks the complexification of the cosmos with based on these evolutionary emergences that occur. So the matter, or the universe starts out, it's all matter, and then life emerges. So you get that break. And then out of life, you get animals with complex nervous systems. And then out of animals with complex nervous systems, which is called mind, the mind level, you get humans with symbolic language. And so this forms this sort of stack, and all these things are dependent on each other, so humans are all of these things, whereas like a dog is just up to the level of mind, whereas a tree is up to the level of life, and soccer ball is just matter. So you get this sort of continuum based on complexity. So complexity comes back in. And one of the things that Greg Enriquez doesn't really explore too much in his work, but that I'm trying to bring in, is basically if we are talking about cultural codes that increase by complexity, well, you can kind of stack that right into that culture level that Greg talks about. And then you can follow this whole cosmic evolutionary story from the Big Bang all the way to the evolution of life, and then to animals, and then you get human culture, and then you get these cultural codes that have evolved and increased in complexity. So that story, that's sort of the big story of the cosmos. It's I would say an equivalent of what we would think of as a creation myth, or a big thing that myths used to do is provide etiologies, which means stories of where things come from. So there's this, we have this really incredible narrative that's sort of become clarified about the nature of the universe that we live in and our place in it. And so that to me sort of beckons to be approached religiously and mythologically, and really integrated in a way that's made the source of our own sense of sort of existential meaning. So that's a lot of what the Emergentism book is about.
Because I mean the matter thing starts with the Big Bang and becomes more and more complex, and structures emerges within that the matter, and then DNA at some point is a molecule that eventually becomes cells. There we have life, and then we got structures within that, and then from life, some of it, as you said, it's nervous systems, and I think Greg dates it at the Cambrian explosion 560 million years ago. And then some of that mind becomes prepositional language, and people asking questions and replying, and then discussing stuff, and then you have temples, and then you have us. And in each of these, he calls them joint points, where there's a joint point joining the different layers or levels of complexity. And by the way, Greg Enriquez was in one of the previous episodes of Nordic Metamodern talking about the difference between pedagogy and psychology. So people can meet him in that conversation. And so where we are right now is that we're probably facing a new joint point, and some people talk about a singularity, so that we're entering a new phase, and that might be the digital AI. A new thing. And from your Emergentism book that I just read, I see that we do share a bit of a worry there, because what's going to happen on the other side of that fifth joint point? What is culture going to create next, and how are we going to deal with that as humans?
Yeah, I think that's sort of one of the existential questions of our particular moment. I feel like God, there's so many angles to this. It's such an important topic, and I think that we need to get this right. So all of this ties in ways I'll try to get at that relate to everything we've been talking about. But there's one narrative that is kind of the transhumanist narrative that I think is particularly popular. It's been around for a while, and it's just this notion that our technology will merge with it. We'll become these cyborgs, or potentially maybe humanity and biological substrates will be lost entirely, and it's just all will be kind of cybernetic machines or what have you. And that's somehow transcendence, I've found that narrative to be completely spiritually hollow and vapid and dangerous, actually. I mean, yeah. And so at the same time, it does seem to resonate with people. It does seem to resonate, especially with kind of the Silicon Valley people. In some ways, it forms a kind of religious narrative that the uber rich kind of, Silicon Valley technocrats believe in, and they feel that they're kind of participating in. And so that is dangerous too. So I would say that that's sort of a warped version of a much more spiritually fulfilling and also whatever the opposite of dangerous is an alternative narrative that is actually incredibly that leads to human flourishing, and it leads to
meaning.
It leads to sustainability. What's that?
Meaning. I mean,
and meaning. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think the key there is situating this kind of big history, tree of knowledge, emergent story that we were just talking about. And then finding the way of bringing that into line with what we're seeing in terms of our technology. But the core there is that we can't lose touch with those other parts of our being, right? Then you just create this sort of top-heavy thing that will collapse on its own weight or lead to some kind of weird, unfortunate dystopia, right? So wherever we're going, it needs to have its roots in matter and our material substrate. It needs to be sustainable and in accord with the living vital principles of biology. It needs to be something that connects with our nervous embodied nature in a very fundamental way. And then it needs to connect to our symbolic justification systems of our meaning-making systems in an important way. So, it's sort of like what we're gaining through these technological abilities is incredible power, but it's a classic issue of, power without wisdom is just tyranny or some kind of destruction waiting to happen, if not full-on just oppression, right? So we have these opportunities to approach what's happening in a way that's more grounded and is existentially rooted and fulfilling. And so to link that back into what we've been talking about, this narrative, and by this narrative, I mean the one that recognizes this cosmic evolutionary unfolding that leads to the development of human consciousness and meaning making and religion, even, and spirituality, that story, that can be kind of talked about scientifically, right? And Greg's work does that, and other big historians do that. And so that propositional side of our rational brain, that kind of modern thinking of ours, can totally assent to that. And in fact, I think it should bring out the awe and the wonder in us. But that alone isn't enough, right? People know these things, but they're scientists, and scientists don't always do the best job at articulating the poetry of existence, right? So what I think we need is to take this incredible narrative of emergent unfolding and articulate it religiously, and to appreciate the spiritual implications of it, not just because then we can do metamodern religion in the way that I feel like makes a lot of sense and that I can really get behind, but also in a kind of very just practical, pragmatic way of trying to stave off our destruction via this sort of transhumanist nonsense getting away from us and all living in some kind of weird AI dystopia, right? So we need to marry our technological innovation with our embodied and spiritual wisdom, And that's sort of the existential challenge of our moment.
So my entry into big history and working with that was when I wrote a book series in Danish about 17 years ago now, called Both And, but in Danish. And part of that was big history, and it was about the evolution and the process of evolution, and where we are in history. I mean, our generation, we're really facing something that no generation has ever faced before us, and so we need to figure out what to do with that, and that's at that joint point, and we need to decide what our future is going to be like. And I totally get how this is a spiritual thing once you learn about the deep history, because when I looked into the emergence of the monkeys, and then the great apes, and then the first Homo, what would that be? First there was Australopithecus, and then there was the Homo habilis, and then Homo erectus, and then probably some kind of archaic Homo sapiens, and then Homo sapiens sapiens about 200,000 or 300,000 years ago. I wouldn't say I developed a crush on Homo erectus, but I had this sense of identifying with something that was extremely deep in my own DNA, so to speak. And that sense of, wow, I am related to these beings who lived 1 million years ago, and who may have had language at the level of, 18-month-old, 2-year-old modern child. They didn't have the vocal cords or the mouth to say very much or very sophisticated, but some proto-language they must have had, and the Neanderthals have very likely also had language, but very simple language. And that sense of it became an emotional connection to these species that have died out 500,000 years ago, some of them. And so I totally get what you're saying. And once you have that feeling, I wouldn't say that I feel related to fish as such, but if you go far enough back, there's this life. I mean, the force of life, the phenomenon life, and that we share that. And then you start looking at plants in a different way, and you see this kind of, it just wants to grow. And we're part of that. I have a bookshelf here that's made out of wood, and I see the wall behind you. I mean, if we go back far enough, we're actually family. So we're part of that same life, and once you, I don't know what the emotion is, but it is a kind of spiritual thing. And then when we look into the future, it's like, so what will life be out there? Because we're just like one link in that chain. Or as you say, we shouldn't talk about it as being a link in that chain or our place in the chain, but more what's the something with the spiral, that we're part of the process.
Yeah, I mean, what we were talking about a minute ago in terms of community, right, I think can really be kind of expanded in a very big way here. So for me, maybe I can't light a candle at the same time that thousands or millions of other people are, but that connection that you're talking about with life itself, I think can be really brought into that religious sensibility as part of this narrative. I would go even deeper, right? I mean, the fact that life emerged, one of the things that's happened, I would say, over the past 50, 60 years is a transition from thinking about life as being a kind of fluke accident that happened to show up here on the planet, to now, I mean, just the other day, I think it was Neil deGrasse Tyson was saying, yeah, we should expect to see life other places. And Carl Sagan was a very important figure for that changing of the tide, to start thinking about the preponderance of life in the universe being much greater than we ever thought. In fact, that as he said, where conditions allow, up it springs. And so to really think that we live in this biophilic universe, that we live in this universe that naturally, because it did, leads to the emergence of life, allows you to then kind of feel part with the universe. And then another thing that Sagan observed and has sort of become, I don't know, a kind of trope in some ways in various physics circles, but he observed that humans are a way for the cosmos to know itself. And if you really take that idea very seriously, then what idea we're talking about here really goes all the way down, that we're not just life experiencing things, we're the universe, we're all of those levels that's emerged, and we are the kind of most enriched, complex, subjectively adorned, to be poetic about it, organism that we know of, and so that, I think, is a very spiritual idea. So I think that there's a lot of depth to this way of looking at the world, and it's also true, at least as far as we know.
It can be documented scientifically,
right? And that to me is a huge element to trying to get over one of those hurdles of the meaning crisis, right? Which is that people will say, oh, well, I'd like to be religious, but I can't say that any of it's true. So what do? I guess everything's just meaningless. Well, if we can have alternative ways of thinking about meaning that are in line with the best of our scientific knowledge, that are true, and that can help us navigate this particularly fraught moment that we're experiencing, of the transition to this hyper-technological society and the gaining of this incredible power, with the very message of, wow, we are all these levels. We are a complex stack of these different emergent levels, and that we can't lose touch with that. That is our very essence. So all of these things start to come together in this notion of, hey, maybe we can do something religious, in this sort of way. And that could be both individually, psychologically, existentially fulfilling, but also culturally the answer that we need at this particular moment.
One thing that blew my mind when I was working on this and started looking into big history and the evolution of our mind and who we are, and you also mention it in your book, is that there were millions and millions of years where there was life on Earth, and there was all this stuff going on. And there were dinosaurs, and there was grass and plants and rodents, and then we get the mammals, and then we get the monkeys and the apes, and gradually, emerging, there is consciousness, that there is mind that sees the world. Mm-hmm. But there was a lot of world where nobody was seeing it at all. Nobody knew it was there because there was nobody. There was not mind that was, how much awareness, how much conscious knowledge of seeing the world does, I don't know, a mosquito have, or elephants are probably, they're pretty much aware of the world around them, but they do not have a language, so they can't really talk about it with each other. And so they cannot coordinate their inner worlds. They can just look from the inside out and notice that, African savanna or Indian forest or whatever. So it really is with humans, or at least the Homo branch on the tree of evolution, that we have the first recognition of, wow, the world is there, and looking up at the stars and asking, so what is that? And then somebody has to come up with an explanation, because somebody asked a question, and you better give an explanation, and until you have language you cannot do that. Mm-hmm. And so we belong to the group of living beings who can see all this, and who can look at the beauty in nature, and look at the sky, and see the ocean, and feel all of it, and share it with each other. And it's just mind-blowing that there were, I don't know, so the Earth is like 3.5 billion years old, and if we've had language for, let's be generous, 1 million years, like relatively complex-ish language, it's basically still 560 million years with life, animals, a little bit more with cells, single cell or multiple cell organisms, and nobody was there to see it. And it just, the process of evolution was going on, and here we are, and I was screwing it all up.
I mean, and this is also one of those points where, depending on what model you have, it shifts a little bit how you relate to this. Consciousness is one of these great mysteries, right? So does consciousness emerge out of matter? Is consciousness fundamental in some panpsychic sense, et cetera? Different people have approaches to that, but I think everyone can agree that consciousness did evolve, and that, yes, the phenomenological experience of a mosquito looking at a sunset is going to be radically different compared to a human being. And again, that comes back to complexity, right? And so when you can put the whole universe, at least the whole Earth, on the spectrum of this complexification, and see that with increased complexification, you get increased kind of conscious awareness that leads to an intelligence that then can become self-aware. That then can lead to a self-awareness that can be aware that it is aware, and to question its own way of thinking about being aware. And then you start getting into, the various forms of meditation and metacognition that lead to being able to be conscious of your own self as a kind of, in some senses, a construction, and then try to get all that down to the core of it. And so, like, the spiritual quest is sort of something itself that emerges out of the very nature of reality. I think that that's an incredible narrative. One of the things I'm really fascinated by is how the notions of God, and we talked about this earlier, God and religion are part of this process, so that religion and theological concepts themselves are part of this emergent unfolding, so that you can say, with some poetic license, I suppose, but not too much, that God evolves, and that we are participating in that activity. And so that's another area where I feel like the metamodern spirituality that I connect with has a very profound sense to it, that my actions as an individual, as an artist, as someone who can create, and other people's with their own ways of being creative and inventive, can put things into culture and into the universe that further the evolution of God. It's in some ways, radical notion, but once you just kind of look at the story, it kind of is right there in front of you. So where this sort of is leading then becomes an obvious question, right? There's this, kind of exponential curve of complexification, and you talk about a fifth joint point in the singularity. I prefer not to look at that singularity as just being purely technological, as some kind of, Moore's law, we're going to get to some cyborg nature, and won't that be special or something, right? Because no, I don't think that that's all that human beings are. So what if that singularity is something more like what Teilhard de Chardin was talking about, of that complexification leading to deeper and deeper consciousness, deeper and deeper self-awareness, and married then to that technological power, you start getting something like the emergence of an immanent divinity, which, at this point you start getting highly speculative, and you lose touch a little bit with some of that scientific grounding. But at least it's a kind of an informed speculation that at least can be a kind of rough aspirational attractor, let's say. Greg Enriquez has his notion of the elephant sun god that kind of is this icon that stands in for that thing. I talk about this image of the omega, or the kaleidoscopic eye, but some kind of postulated point of complexification where you get something spiritual and not just technological. And I think that is fundamentally what's missing from the kind of more simplistic transhumanist narrative. And I think that that's what I'm trying to correct for in some of these metamodernist, emergentist articulations.
So speaking as a theologian now, what when I look at what you have created here, I see a theology. But what I'm missing is the service and the higher purpose and the community, which we already talked about. But the sense of there's a higher purpose. There's a truth. There's something that I need to serve in order to be a good human being and to serve the grace of God, or whatever it is that is the promise, the hope. We've almost touched upon the hope, but what would you say is what is the higher purpose? What is the sacred? What is the what is the beyond the theology? What is the rest of the religious package here?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think it's a theological. It's where the kind of more strictly scientific angle then starts to bleed into the explicitly theological. And I think as much as we talk about a religion that's not a religion in these circles, I think that you can't have a religion without that stuff that you're talking about, the theological angle and the sacred and all that. And for me, it's very much there, though I can see how, based on the way that we've tended to think about religion and spirituality, it's not as maybe obvious. But the way I look at it is that traditionally God, in let's say a pre-modern cultural code, is understood to be supernatural, like outside the world in a transcendent way. And then you could kind of relate to that. Well, then, we can't, at least I don't think, do the supernatural thing anymore with the advent of modernity and rational science and empiricism. But we can understand that same entity, that same force, that same being as being within the world, but chronologically distant, if that makes sense. When we're talking about cosmic evolution, we're talking about this thing that's been unfolding for billions of years and has billions of years left. And if we're seeing this trajectory of this complexification that leads to deeper consciousness, a deeper moral sensibility, we haven't talked about this, but this relates a lot to bildung and development. Metamodern perspectives are multi-perspectival in the sense that they are cognizant of different ways of being, and it takes being cognizant of different ways of being to be able to relate to those ways of being. Otherwise, you're stuck in yourself and you're egocentric and you think that your way of looking at the world is the only way. And so gaining multi-perspectival lensing on the world is a moral activity, and the more that we can do that, the more open we are and the more inclusive we can become. And so this is another element of complexification. So complexification makes you essentially more inclusive, more open-minded, more curious, more open to the mystery, and again, more conscious. And so if this is the trajectory and you kind of extrapolate that, I think that divinity, that God, doesn't lie outside of history. It lies beyond us in time. It lies in the future. And so this then leads to the issue of community, because, well, this is our task. This is what we're called to participate in. I talk about the metaphor of building the cathedral, that's what we're all doing together, right? But we're not building a cathedral to a particular God that we worship on some particular day or what have you. We're building the cathedral of the very notion of a new God concept. We're putting into the world, this is what I'd like to see anyway, this is what I'm trying to do and what I'm trying to get people excited about. But ideally, we could be putting into the world new images, new symbols, new ways for God to be expressed for people, especially at a time when people feel like, oh, there is no God, or there is no meaning, or this or that. This is an incredibly meaningful task to undertake, I think. So the community element for me is the participation in the crafting, the construction, the unfolding of God in time, and we do our own small part in that, but collectively, we are part of a big group that is lighting our own candle in our own way, on the face of the globe. So that is the notion of the sacred that I have. I look in the past and I see, the lion can attack the gazelle and have no moral qualms about it because, well, it's not a fault of the lion. It's that morality doesn't emerge at the level of mind. Morality, as we think of it, emerges at the level of culture and self-conscious beings that can relate to each other. So this is a process that's unfolded naturally. These are emergences that, when we track how they've developed, lead to something that is increasingly beautiful, increasingly good, and increasingly powerful. We see that very clearly with the technology, right? The power is coming online, but we've got to get the goodness and the beauty to match that. And that, again, is the communal thing that we need to get online with ourselves. So that's the church component. And I think that that's the sacred that I relate to.
Cool. We're about to end. I'm really happy that we could have this conversation. I'm really happy that we could get actually very deep into where we come from and who we are in a different way than we normally talk about it. So I'd like to thank you for that, and I can highly recommend your Emergentism and your Metamodern spirituality in all its forms. And I hope that that we can, no matter what we call it, serve a higher purpose, because I think the world needs that.
I agree, and I very much appreciate this opportunity to come on this podcast and talk to you. You are, leading the charge in many ways in the metamodern ecosystem on so many fronts. So I appreciate all the work that you're doing. And we're doing our parts, we're doing our things, and I think that maybe it might sound a little too strong to call it a higher purpose for some, but I think of it that way. I think that what we're doing is meaningful, and I think that this metamodern ecosystem is collectively trying to do something that will make the world a better place. And I think that that's the kind of stuff we need to be engaging in. So anyway, I appreciate this opportunity, and I look forward to more conversations down the road.
I would even go so far to talk about hope,
as we should,
because we do not talk a lot about that. So I think that's actually what we're talking about, without having said it so far. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.